can see just to the right. I don't think that puts the corner.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Yes. Good afternoon.
Like it, yeah.
Is that how you record this now?
Next to the pink is possible, isn't it?
It's funny waiting, isn't it? Only 5 minutes.
And Andy, can I just ask a technical question? Do I have any sort of time limit at which Zoom is going to stop or anything, or so that there's no issue with?
I've got the so it's fine.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
We are muted, yes, man.
But obviously, we
Are we muted?
we usually talk for up to.
Are we muted? Oh, muted. Sorry.
14 minutes.
Oh, I thought it was a pint of beer. A can of beer.
That's why you click on the red. There's two reds to the left cushion. Leave himself half by those play the black. Quite tricky all round the opening of this break, isn't it? Very awkward. The split in the way he was positioned. Absolutely straightforward, any part of it. Trying to work out that if he plays a screw shot, where we promote the pink to there.
76 participants so far.
Right there. Which looks like that was a lovely little shot. Sorted that one out beautifully. Open the pink out. I can shot that.
She said it that. She just walked out.
Oh,
She just ran out the door.
did you?
Yeah.
You must count people. You must count people. Oh, screens. No, I won't count you. To be 3.
Got my thumb.
Still gets through the spray. Walking about. I don't think he's not. Be with.
Hey, Barry.
Hello. Hello.
Does it have our picture up?
Yeah, that is still possible on the pink spots. No, there it is.
Make it bigger.
We're nearly standing now. Yeah, that's definitely on. So work to be done, but a good chance to be a real sickener for Joe. He's playing pretty decent for the first time in the semi-final.
It's easy. He's taking it easy.
Moved down.
Back in the chair.
He's got a chance to come back to the table.
Look at that, his tummy on his tummy.
Well,
Chair.
Middle, in the middle, to the right corner.
you silly.
People in an area.
Can't see any hangings or anything.
One line. Trying.
The more difficult of the reds.
Right.
You fancy on the other side if you're right-handed, so
We're almost
very
ready.
ominous. The start of the break then. Way to unlock the puzzle. Back to the table.
I've switched video.
Right, I'm going to mute everybody now because it's almost time to start. You'll be able to unmute yourself if you have a question later. Also, because there's so many people here, there's 82 people
signed on, which is probably means there's over 100 people watching because there's lots of couples. If you have a question or think of a question during the talk or at the end, if you can send it to me via the chat button at the bottom, and then I can ask.
Just put the sound on.
In order.
Chat.
I don't know what to do there. I've no idea.
There's a right at the bottom of the screen, there's a small button that says chat. If you take your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you can type into that. Click on that and type in, and I can see the questions. The other point is we've got a lot of people here, and Zoom say if you've got more than 20 people, it can start degrading people who've not got a very good internet connection. But they ask if people could actually stop their videos if they don't need to have them on, because you'll still be able to see the speaker and you'll still be able to hear and everything. You can switch on your video later, but while the talk's going on, I would appreciate if people would switch off their videos. Okay, thank you. Perhaps it's time to hand over to Ian now. You want to unmute yourself, Ian? Ian? Don't see Ian. Ian, are you there? We seem to have lost our chair. I saw him earlier, but I can't see him now. Well, perhaps we could start the meeting and Ian can make any announcements later. We're very pleased to have Alison Rowlands here, Professor from Essex University, who'll be giving our talk today. And if you want to unmute yourself, Alison, and get going. I'm sorry, Ian would have had more to say, but he's not here. Doesn't appear to be here at the moment. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy, and thank you to the Chelmsford Historical Association for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. What I'm going to do in a sec is screen share, because I've got some images and things on PowerPoint to share with you. So hopefully, if the technology all works, you should be able to see my my screen.
Yes.
Great, thanks, Andy. Right, let's get to the first slide then. Okay, so the title of my talk this afternoon is Early Modern European Witch Trials, Essex in a Comparative Perspective. So I'm going to have a focus obviously on Essex witch trials, but I'm also going to use the talk to set what was going on in Essex in a broader comparative context. So I'd like to begin with a look at George Gifford, who was the town preacher of Malden in Essex in the late 16th century. In 1593, George Gifford, the town preacher of Malden in Essex, published a text which was called A Dialogue Concerning Witches and Witchcrafts. Gifford began his text with two fictional local men called Daniel and Samuel, and Gifford made them meet and have a fictional conversation, the dialogue of the title, discussing their thoughts about witchcraft in the county. Samuel was particularly fearful of what he called evil, favoured old witches. Samuel went on to comment that truly we dwell here in a bad country, meaning a county. I think even one of the worst in England. He added, there is scarce any town or village in all this shire, but there is one or two witches at the least in it. So what I want to do is start off with this idea of Samuel's and Gifford's that Essex was the worst in England. And I want to try and test out this contention that as far as witches were concerned, Essex was the worst county in all of England. I want to ask what sort of evidence we have to support this idea. And does it actually hold up when we look at it more closely? I then want to go on and set the Essex witch trials into this wider European context to compare them and see where they sat in terms of size and severity in relation to other parts of Europe at this time, so in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, at this time, belief in witchcraft was incredibly widespread. Most people who lived in the 16th and 17th century in Europe believed in witches. And by that, I mean people believed that a witch could cause them harm through magic, so could do them, their families, their livestock, their health, some damage through magical means. That was one important aspect of the belief in witchcraft. And the other part of belief in witchcraft was the idea that witches were in league with the forces of evil, in league with the devil. And so we're also committing a sort of a religious crime as well as being workers of magical harm. So this was pretty serious stuff. This concern about witchcraft was obviously underpinned by these beliefs in witches as powerful and threatening beings. And as well as this very widespread belief in witchcraft, all early modern European countries had laws against witchcraft. They had criminalized witchcraft at the highest political and legal level. And we can see that in England. This is a sort of a summary table of the laws against witchcraft in England at this time. The first statute was passed in 1563 in the reign of Elizabeth, very early on in the reign of Elizabeth I. And that first statute was then made more severe in the early part of the reign of Elizabeth's successor, James I of England. So we have a statute from 1563 and then a later, more severe statute from 1604. So this is the legal framework for English witch trials, but obviously also Essex witch trials. And we can see from this table that obviously the rulers of England, that the Parliament, the monarch, the judges, the courts are taking witchcraft seriously, and indeed in many cases for the various different aspects of magic that were being punished here, the penalty is death. So you know, this is regarded as a really, really serious capital crime. And this sort of legislation is appearing all across Europe in the 16th century. So this real concern with witchcraft is shared by politicians and rulers across the board. So we're seeing the English legislation here. So given this widespread belief, then this widespread concern about witchcraft, and given this widespread attempt to legislate against it, we've got, if you like, essential preconditions to create witch persecution everywhere. And I think it's quite interesting. When we look at the comparative context later, we'll see that actually some areas end up with lots and lots of witch trials, and other areas are much more restrained. And it's quite interesting. One of the things I'm interested in is sort of exploring why some areas end up having lots of witch persecutions, whereas others have barely any at all. So that's the context then, belief in witchcraft and laws against witchcraft. Let's then test out the idea of fictional Samuel from Malden. Was Essex indeed the worst county in all of England? What sort of evidence is there that we can piece together to test out his idea? Well, the first thing that we can say is that Essex has the first execution for witchcraft under the Elizabethan Witchcraft Statute of 1563. So reasonably quickly after that statute was enacted in 1563, we get the first execution for witchcraft, and it happens in Essex. So the first person to be hanged for witchcraft in England after that act is an Essex woman called Elizabeth Lewis of Great Waltham, and she was actually accused of having murdered 3 people by witchcraft, one of whom was a 3-year-old boy, the 3-year-old son of one of her neighbours from Great Waltham. So very quickly after that act was passed, Essex people used it to begin to accuse other people of witchcraft, and indeed we saw this very, very early execution in 1564. So Essex has the first execution. Essex also, and I should say I've lived in Essex now since 1992. I'm based in Wivenhoe. So when I say we, I am meaning the county of Essex. We, the county of Essex, also had the first witchcraft pamphlet. So this is the first printed text about these witches and about the witch trials that were going on. So Essex also, as well as having the first execution, also has the first witchcraft pamphlet, and that was published in London, printed in London in 1566. And it rejoiced in the title, The Examination and Confession of Certain Witches at Chelmsford, meaning Chelmsford, in the county of Essex. And this was a very detailed account of the trials for witchcraft of 3 women who were actually all from Hatfield Peveril. The reason the pamphlets often say that the witches are at Chelmsford or of Chelmsford is not because the women were from Chelmsford, but because the trials, the Assais court trials that the pamphlets are detailing, take place in Chelmsford. So because it's this really important legal centre for the Assais trials, often that's captured in the title of the pamphlets. So this pamphlet details the trials for witchcraft of Elizabeth Francis and a woman called Agnes Waterhouse, and we're pretty certain Agnes was Elizabeth's sister, and also Agnes's daughter Joan of Hatfield Peveril. So we've got a really interesting sort of family group of alleged female witches in this very early pamphlet, and we know from the pamphlet that Agnes was probably aged around 60, 64 at the time of her trial, and her daughter Joan was somewhere in the region of 18. Elizabeth was probably a little bit younger than Agnes, but we're not sure. And of these 3, Agnes ends up being hanged for witchcraft at Chelmsford in 1566. And this pamphlet was incredibly groundbreaking. It's not just the first witchcraft pamphlet, but it's also got really interesting testimony in it about witches' familiars. And these were the strange imp-like creatures that witches in England were supposed to have particular relationships with, and they were also regarded as the sort of the source of a lot of the witch's evil. So they were regarded as sort of evil spirits that the witch worked with and worked through. And in this case, Elizabeth Francis has a witch's familiar that was a cat called Satan. So you can see how it was being imagined by contemporaries as a sort of demonic evil being. But also there was a very detailed description of a demonic dog, a devil dog, involved in this trial as well. So it would have been very, very newsworthy, very sensational, very new, very radical for its time. It was also illustrated, which again, in terms of the sort of novelty and the impact of these ideas, obviously if you provide illustrations in the pamphlet, as well as the narrative, the story of the trial, you've got this very bizarre and fantastical being, the devil dog, which has the sort of the horns of a cow, and a key that he'd stolen that's around his neck. And the illustrator, the pamphleteer, has tried to render that very strange image in the illustration. But it also shows us witches. It actually tries, very crudely obviously, but it tries to capture in the printed pamphlet the identities of these accused women. And here we can see Mother Waterhouse, Agnes Waterhouse, on the right, and her daughter Joan on the left. So in terms of actually spreading ideas about witches, it's very, very interesting because of the illustrations that it has as well. So first execution, first pamphlet. Essex also has the dubious honour of having the most witchcraft pamphlets published about it relative to other counties. So it starts early and it carries on publishing pamphlets. So in addition to that first one that I just mentioned from 1566, 4 more pamphlets about witch trials in Essex were published, most of them in the latter part of the 16th century. So we have another one in 1579, another one in 1589, and another one in 1582. And then we also get one published in 1645. So altogether there are 5 Essex witchcraft pamphlets. This woodcut is another very interesting and important illustration from one of these Essex pamphlets, which was from the 1589 pamphlet, and it shows the hangings, the executions of 3 women, Joan Cunny of Stysted, Joan Prentice of Sybil Headingham, and Joan Utney of Dagenham. And again, they are being tried collectively in the Assais courts in Chelmsford and being executed in Chelmsford. And then the publisher, the pamphleteer, is publishing the pamphlet about them in London. And here we can see the 3 women being hanged. And we can see again in the foreground that this very important English, peculiarly English idea of the witches' familiars, these imp-like evil spirits, and they're often given names by the witches supposedly. So we've got Jack and Jill, you can see down there. But the really interesting image I think on this pamphlet was of Joan Prentice, and she supposedly had a demonic ferret called Bid, who did her bidding, her evil bidding, hence the name. And in this strange image, we can see the demonic ferret Bid sucking some blood from Joan's cheek. And the idea here was that the witch nurtured the familiar through food, through giving them shelter, and through allowing them occasionally to suck blood. But the interesting thing about that as well as it suggesting this really intense bond between the witch and the familiar, it also was believed to leave evidence by leaving marks on the witch's face, so that courts could actually look at witches' faces or bodies to see if they had these marks on their faces. So it looks very strange to us now, but it was this really important evidence of the link between the witch and her familiar. So the most pamphlets. We've also in Essex got the longest, we provide the longest, the most detailed of all the 16th century pamphlets. So the Essex pamphlet from 1582 is very, very long, very, very detailed. And it was published about a set of trials that have become known as the St. Ozith witch trials, and as we can see from the title here, that they went in for very, very long titles in the 16th century. This was called A True and Just Record of the Information, Examination and Confession of all the witches taken at St. Ozith's in the county of Essex, wherein all men may see what a pestilent people witches are, and how unworthy to live in a Christian commonwealth. So there's this very strong idea of the witch as an unchristian person who needed to be got rid of. And this pamphlet was so long, the St. Ozith witch trial pamphlet was so long because it was actually detailing the largest 16th century trial that took place in England. So that's another piece of evidence about how particularly bad the witch trials were in Essex. So Essex has the longest 16th century witch trial, and that produced, perhaps unsurprisingly, the longest 16th century witch trial pamphlet from St. Ozith's in 1582. This trial was largely the result of the zeal and industry of a local justice of the peace whose name was Brian Darcy. And although we call this, we kind of refer to this trial episode by the shorthand of the St. Ozith witch trial, it actually involved 14 suspected witches altogether, 7 of whom were from St. Ozith, but 7 of whom were from other nearby communities. And this is pretty big numbers, you know, compared to any other trial episode that's gone before. You know, we saw in 1566 3 women, but here by 1582 we're seeing 14. So we can see it is very large by comparison to these other trials that have happened in the 16th century. It is unusual, and we can see again sort of evidence of this level of sort of exceptionality. We can see Darcy using child witnesses to testify, often against their own parents, about their parents' familiars, for example, which is very unusual. And Darcy also used quite dubious tactics to get suspects to confess. He promised them favour, for example, to make them confess. And unsurprisingly, some of them, you know, believed him and made some fairly spectacular confessions. And although the pamphlet just says, if you remember on the title page, it said published by WW, excuse me, we're pretty sure that Darcy oversaw and sort of instigated the publication of the pamphlet because he was trying to foreground his role in the trials. He wants to make a name for himself, essentially. He wants to try and further his career by successfully having a large witch hunt, and the pamphlet, the publication of the pamphlet following the trial, was part of that endeavour. So, largest 16th century witch trial, longest 16th century witchcraft pamphlet. This is all Essex contributions. Essex also has the most indictments. Now, indictments were the formal charges drawn up against witches at the Assais courts. Most of the trials for witches in England at this time take place at the Assais courts, because witchcraft is a capital crime and because you can be executed for it. Most of the trials are taking place at these Assais courts. There are a few exceptions there. There are some borough courts that have jurisdiction over witchcraft in their own boroughs, but for the most part, most of these cases, because they are so serious, go to the Assais courts. And one problem that historians have here is that indictments don't survive across all of England in this period, so we can't compare Essex with every other English county simply because we're at the mercy of the way in which the sources have survived. But we can at least compare Essex with other counties in what was called the home circuit of the Assise courts. So this was the circuit of counties that Assise judges would be sent out on twice a year by the monarch. So these are the courts overseen by these royal judges that are sent out by the English monarch to sort of dispense royal justice in the counties. And the Assise courts take place twice a year across the English counties. And the home circuit was made up of these counties: Sussex, Surrey, Kent, Hertfordshire and Essex. And you know, we can see here, I say we because this is taken from the work of an English historian of witchcraft, James Sharp. And what Sharp's done is he's added up all the indictments, the charges, the formal charges of witchcraft that were made in the home circuit courts. Now, there are many more indictments than there are actual accused individuals, and that was because one person could be charged with several counts of witchcraft. So these aren't individuals who were charged with witchcraft, but it's the number of charges brought against individuals. But even on that basis, we can see that Essex stands out in the context of the home circuit. It's got about 60% of the total indictments for witchcraft of all the home circuit counties, and the next sort of worst affected, if you like, Kent, is a good long way behind. So that, I think, is giving us a real sense of the degree to which Essex was providing a lot of court cases in England. This probably means that Essex also actually has, sadly, the most executions. I mean, the reason I put a question mark there is simply to flag the fact that sources don't survive very well across the rest of England. But I would be willing to suggest that Essex probably does really have the most executions. And the reason I say that is because spectacular trials tend to produce pamphlets. They tend to go into print because obviously the printers and publishers know that pamphlets about big witch trials are going to sell. So I think if there had been, lots and lots of executions in other parts of the country, we would probably see that reflected in pamphlets. So I think there is a bit of sort of doubt and a few question marks around the issue of source survival, but I think we're probably on reasonably solid ground that that Essex is one of the worst, if not the worst. And again, to give you some comparative context, historians of English witchcraft have worked out, insofar as we can, that there were probably around 500 executions for witchcraft in total in the 16th and 17th century, starting with the execution of Elizabeth Lewis in 1564, with the last executions for witchcraft in England happening in the 1680s. So the ballpark total for England then is around 500. We know from the work that historians, particularly Alan Macfarlane, has done on the Essex Assizes, which do have these good records, that of about 291 people accused of witchcraft, around 129 were found guilty, with 74 of them being executed and 55 imprisoned. And the reason for the number of imprisonments was because under the 1563 English witchcraft statute, if you had only harmed somebody by witchcraft but not murdered them, for a first offence, the penalty wasn't execution. The penalty in that context was a year's imprisonment with 3 appearances in the pillory. So although it wasn't execution, it was still a horrible punishment, because obviously early modern prisons were very dirty and unsanitary, and you're quite likely to die of disease in the prisons. So although we look at that and we think, well, imprisonment isn't as bad, obviously, as being hanged, it's still a fairly severe penalty. And we know that probably around 36 accused individuals in Essex died in jail, either having been imprisoned or even in some cases before they'd been tried. Or in some ironic cases, we have individuals who might actually have been found not guilty, but because they're left in jail until their jail fees are paid, and if they're poor, that could be quite a long time. So even some individuals who have been actually found not guilty of witchcraft might end up dying in prison because, as I said, the conditions were so bad. So probably around 110 deaths in total. But even if we just look at the figure for the executions that we know about, and again, there's probably more that are lost to the historical records. So even if we just look at the known executions, we're looking at something like 74 out of 500 in total. So obviously Essex accounts for a pretty high proportion of the overall total of executions for witchcraft in England. We also have the dubious honour, and I'm really mean the Tendring Hundred, where I live. This northeast corner of Essex has the dubious honour of being the starting point of a witch hunt that many of you may be familiar with, the largest ever set of English witch trials, the East Anglian witch trials, which happen during the English Civil War between 1645 and 1647. And these are the witch trials that have become very, very strongly associated with the name of Matthew Hopkins, which is why I've used this image here. This is from Matthew Hopkins' own publication about witchcraft, about his activities during the East Anglian witch trials, where he gives himself the entirely self-styled title of Witchfinder General. This is what he calls himself. It wasn't a job description that he'd applied for. It was his own sense of himself as a witchfinder. So here he is in 1647, just before he died. Actually, he published a text about his activities, and he gave this image of himself on the introductory pages. So these large witch trials, the East Anglian witch trials then of 1645 to 47, begin in Essex, in Manningtree, and they're very much under the leadership of two local justices of the peace. So in much the same way that the St. Ozith witch trial was instigated by Brian Darcy, by the local JP in 1582, we get a very similar set of events happening in Manningtree in 1645. We get the two local JPs, Sir Thomas Bowes and Sir Harbottle Grimston, kickstarting the East Anglian witch trials of 1645 to 7, and they invite in, to help them, they invite in two local men, John Sterne and Matthew Hopkins, who go on to sort of claim that they are witch finders, experienced witch finders. So again, Manningtree kickstarts that very large trial episode. And I think as well we can say that what happens in Essex in 1645 ensures the continuation of this largest ever English witch hunt. Because if the Essex phase of that witch hunt hadn't sort of taken off, if there had been lots of acquittals and lots of not guilty verdicts when those trials are held in Chelmsford in the summer of 1645, it's very unlikely, I think, that the trial episode would have continued, because if the courts had not found lots of people guilty and not executed lots of individuals in 1645, it's very unlikely that the impetus for the East Anglian witch trials would have carried on. And it's a very harrowing statistic, but 19 accused witches, they were all women, 19 women from the Tendring Hundred, so communities around Manningtree, including Wivenhoe, including my own home community. 19 women from the Tendring Hundred were condemned to death at the courts in Chelmsford in 1645, and 15 of them were executed en masse. So we have this mass execution in Chelmsford in July of 1645, and that's the largest ever mass execution of witches that had ever taken place up until that point in time. And the image that I've got on the slide here is the title page of John Sterne's text, because like Matthew Hopkins, John Sterne also publishes a book about his activities as a witch finder, and we can see that he calls himself John Sterne, now of Lawshall near Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, sometimes of Manningtree in Essex. So that's sort of putting him in that Essex context. He actually was living in, or having had some sort of house or temporary accommodation in Manningtree at the beginning of the East Anglian witch hunts. And this very, very high conviction rate and this very, very high rate of execution in Chelmsford in 1645, as I said before, really gives the go-ahead, it gives the green light to not just the witch finders, but other local communities, witnesses and accusers who supported the witch finders. It really gives the go-ahead and the green light to the witch finders to continue their persecution of witches across East Anglia in the following months. So I think if the court in Chelmsford had not been so severe, I think that would really, if they acquitted lots of the suspects, lots of the accused, that would really have sort of stopped the East Anglian witch trials in their tracks. Okay, so it looks pretty bleak so far. If you look at the markers of evidence for Essex being the worst county, then, you know, there is a lot. We've got early witch trials, early pamphlets, lots of pamphlets, long pamphlets, the largest ever 16th century trial, the most indictments, the most executions, and also Essex as the starting point of the largest ever English witch hunt. So I think, you know, if you ask me, do I agree with Samuel in Gifford's dialogue that Essex was the worst county in England, I would probably say yes. I think it does look, it looks very bleak, and the evidence is certainly there. But I just wanted to just qualify a couple of those points, just to sort of perhaps paint a slightly less bleak picture of quite how bad witch persecution was in Essex. And I think the first thing to say is that yes, it was bad, but for the most part, it's a 16th century story in Essex. And what I mean by that is, apart from, and this is obviously a fairly significant caveat, apart from the 1645 trials involving Hopkins and Stern and starting in Manningtree, apart from those trials, which were very exceptional because they take place during the English Civil War, if we could leave those out of the picture, the story of witch persecution in Essex is really very much a kind of a late 16th century story. And actually, apart from that mid 17th century outburst in East Anglia, things were pretty much on the decline in Essex otherwise in the 17th century. So I think what we're seeing in Essex then is a real kind of enthusiasm for witch persecution, particularly in the 16th century, which sort of runs its course apart from the East Anglian witch trials in the 17th century. And I wanted to sort of make that point by showing you a couple of graphs, and these are taken from the excellent study of Essex Witchcraft by Alan McFarlane. And this first graph here shows the punishment for witchcraft at the Essex Assizes from 1560 to 1680. And we're looking at the number of persons probably executed and the number of persons probably imprisoned. But the point about it is, apart from this dramatic spike up to 19 in 1645, if that were not in the picture, you can see that really the really active time for witch persecution resulting in execution in Essex is from the 1560s to the early part of the 17th century. That the only execution after that, apart from 1645, is in the 1620s. So Essex has a really early engagement with witch trials and a really early engagement with the legislation, which is reflected very much in those 16th century pamphlets. But really in the 17th century, the courts are getting much less likely to convict people, much less keen to convict people, apart from the very particular circumstances of the Civil War in the 1640s. And a similar story is told by this graph, again from McFarlane's very good study, which looks at accusations. And again, interestingly, again, we see this very dramatic peak in 1645, where there were 36 people accused, 36 women accused. But again, we can really see that the main period of numbers of accusations is the latter part of the 16th and early part of the 17th century. I think what's interesting in Essex is that accusations do carry on in the 17th century, perhaps at a lower level, but what the courts are very sort of wary of as the 17th century goes on is of any more executions. The story of executions is really a story of the late 16th century and the very exceptional moment of 1645. Another way in which we might sort of create a caveat is by just going back to those exceptional East Anglian witch trials of 1645 to 1647. Now, while it's absolutely true that they start in Essex, and while it's absolutely true that the Essex executions help encourage the spread of those witch trials, the county that's actually worst affected in 1645 to 47 is Suffolk. Suffolk has more executions than any other county, and it sadly surpassed the mass execution that had taken place in Chelmsford in 1645 by having the largest mass execution of witches that ever took place in English history, and that was of 18 people in Bury St Edmunds in 1645. So, you know, if people thought things were bad in Essex in the Tendring Hundred in 1645, they only got a lot worse once the witch finders went into Suffolk. And Suffolk also saw the most exceptional executions. And it's annoying, I should have thought of this, but you can't quite see. You may be able to just see this image that there's a man being hanged. This is the village sign of the village, the Suffolk village of Brandeston. And this is actually showing the execution of a man called John Lowes. And he was one of the 18 executed in Bury in August 1645. And John Lowes was an 80-year-old minister of the church. And he was actually the only church minister ever to be hanged for witchcraft in England. And he's one of only 4 Protestant ministers who were ever executed for witchcraft in Europe. So I think that's really the fact that you could not just get these mass executions in Suffolk, but you could actually get a man of the cloth being hanged, shows just how much more exceptional the witch trials, the East Anglian witch trials, were in Suffolk than they were in Essex. The other point that's worth bearing in mind is that actually one reason why the witch finders head off into Suffolk in 1645, I mean, it's partly because they are originally from Suffolk themselves. So both John Sterne and Matthew Hopkins came from Suffolk families originally, came from Suffolk communities originally. So I think it made a lot of sense for them to head over the River Stour and go off into Suffolk. But another reason they did that was because Colchester said no. Colchester authorities actually told the witch finders pretty much that they weren't going to play ball. They didn't really want them interfering in the borough jurisdiction in Colchester by spreading their witch finding activities there. But I think there was also a much more pragmatic reason why Colchester opposed the witch finders, and that was because the jail at Colchester Castle, where all these women from the Tendring Hundred were being held. So before they were taken off to Chelmsford for their trials in the summer of 1645, they were being held in the Colchester Castle jail. And several of them died of the plague there because the conditions were so appalling. So I think it was probably a somewhat pragmatic self-interest by the Colchester authorities. They basically didn't want a plague epidemic starting in the town. That was one reason why I think their enthusiasm for witch finding declined, and that helps explain as well why Hopkins and Sterne head off into Suffolk to pursue their luck there rather than carrying on further south in Essex. The question that's always asked, and I don't think this has really been answered fully or adequately or very well, and I'm sure the question that's in lots of people's minds at the moment is, you know, why was it so bad in Essex? Because that seems to me to be a very obvious question. You know, we'd like to try and explain why it was so bad in Essex. Well, I think we've got sort of early adoption, if you like, in Essex. We've got early adoption of the new legislation. So that 1563 statute that I mentioned earlier, there's very quick action. We can see that even in the Assais courts of 1560, people are trying to prosecute witches in Essex, and we get that very early execution in 1564. So I think where you get communities that are sort of early adopters, that sets a pattern So if people use the legislation and use it successfully in their eyes, insofar as they get people hanged as a result, then that gives encouragement to others to think, oh, we could do the same. So there's very early adoption in Essex, and successful trials that end in executions early on, encourage further accusations. And I think the pamphlets that I talked about earlier, that early production of pamphlets in Essex and the frequent production of pamphlets in Essex also helps to disseminate ideas to other communities. And we also get very important key individuals, and it's often local JPs, perhaps trying to make a name for themselves, perhaps with London connections or court connections, who are often the reason, I think, why we get these sort of outbursts of energy in relation to witch persecution. So JPs like Brian Darcy in St Ozith, or Sir Harbottle Grimston and Thomas Bowes in Manningtree. I think there are probably more of them, but we just don't know enough about them, sadly. We don't have enough evidence to be able to identify more of those individuals. But my hunch is that there are probably more of them than we know about at the moment. One of the ironies of Brian Darcy's activity, and again, this is perhaps a little bit of a caveat about how bad Essex was. One of the ironies of Brian Darcy's activity in St Ozith in 1582 is that he was so zealous and tried so hard to whip up witch trials that it actually caused a backlash. So one of the sort of ironic benefits, if you like, of this St Ozith witch trial was it actually creates a backlash of criticism. And the first and very radical critique of witch persecution that was, and it's the first major critique that's published at all in England. It's one of the most radical criticisms of witch trials that's published in the 16th century. It's published by a man called Reginald Scott in 1584. He was a Kentish gentleman, and it's very likely that Reginald Scott's publication was in response to the St Ozith witch trials and what he'd learnt about what was going on there from the pamphlet. He criticises Brian Darcy in several places in his book for his methods, for using children as witnesses, for using lewd, miserable and envious poor people as witnesses. So he's basically saying that he's abusing his legal authority and his legal power. And he also criticises Darcy for winning confessions through hope of favour, or by extorting confessions by flattery or threats without any proof. So he's essentially saying that Brian Darcy is a really, really bad JP who is not using the law properly. And Scott was also very, very scornful of the belief in witches' familiars. This is very radical, very ahead of its time, to say, you know, devils can't really take bodily form. You know, how can you possibly think a ferret can be the devil? So it's very, very scathing, very radical. And I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have written it if it hadn't been with the St Ozith witch trial. And that's the cover of Scott's book. And he's really writing because he has sympathy and pity for the poor, miserable and ignorant people who are condemned for witchcraft. So he sees the victims of the witch trials as the real you know, people with whom we should be having sympathy, and he sees it as a real tragedy that they were executed. Just to finish off then, how does this all sit within the wider European context? Well, obviously I can't go into massive detail on all of the rest of Europe. My own area of expertise is on German witchcraft. So I just wanted to finish off with a few very, very harrowing and sad league tables, just to help do some of this comparison a little bit more quickly for you. And these are very, very interesting tables of data, which have been put together by a German historian of witch trials called Wolfgang Behringer. And this is a table which Behringer put together, and it looks very sensible. You know, if you want to try and compare the severity of witch trials, this looks like a very sensible way of doing it, but it's actually really, really hard because we don't have a lot of the statistics very accurately. But what Behringer tried to do in this table was look at the number of executions for witchcraft relative to the number of inhabitants of a country. And obviously, again, the stats are a little bit unsure. And the other really problematic thing about this table, which, you know, I have taxed, I know Wolfgang Behring reasonably well, and I've sort of said to him, you know, this was not good. What he did was, you'll see he's actually collapsed England and Scotland into Britain. And that really matters because Scotland had a much higher rate of execution than England. So, you know, if you imagine England in there with only 500 executions relative to its population, it would be even lower down this league table. So Behring has slightly skewed the figures by collapsing Scotland and England together. But even so, so the ratio per capita of executions for witchcraft, then you can see that Britain has a ratio of 1 execution for witchcraft per 4,667 people, which is obviously much lower than a lot of places in the rest of Europe. It's not by any means the lowest. I think probably that would be Ireland, where it's 1 per 250,000, but it's certainly much lower than somewhere like Liechtenstein, which had a 1 in 10, or Germany, which had a 1 in 640. And we can see in Germany, for example, the total number of executions is just absolutely off the scale by comparison with England. So if we've got a total for England of witchcraft executions of 500, we can see Germany had 25,000. So this is a league table that England is nowhere near the top of, and that's a jolly good thing because it means that it actually executed relatively few people for witchcraft in comparative terms. If we had it with its 500 though, it would be you know, relatively sort of restrained in terms of its comparative position. And just to give you an idea of how terrible some of the German witch trial episodes were by comparison. So remember, England, the total nationally is 500. If we take the focus down regionally to some parts of Germany, you know, we can see that some of the worst German witch trials were happening in relatively small territories in relatively short periods of time, and they were, you know, infinitely worse than what was going on in total in England. So, for example, just to take one of these, the bishopric of Bamberg between 1626 and 1630, so in about a 4-year period, this German territory executed 600 people for witchcraft. It executed more people in 4 years than the total whole number of executions for England throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. So we can see that compared to some of these German territories, the English witch trials were relatively, and I do emphasize the word relatively restrained. And again, another way that Behring has put this together is by some of the largest witch hunts in Europe. And we can see that England and Essex are absolutely nowhere near there. But the only sort of UK territory that makes it onto the league table is Scotland, which executes actually probably somewhere in the region of more like 1,500, we know now, 1,500 people for witchcraft between 1560 and 1670. So obviously these German trials are much worse, much more severe, much more rapid, happening in a much shorter period of time. And the sorts of mass executions, I mean, if you remember earlier, I showed you that image of the 3 Essex women being hanged for witchcraft. What you would have seen in these very large episodes of witch persecution in Germany would have been mass executions by burning, not hanging. And this image here shows a 17th century mass execution. And what you can see, hopefully, on the left there is the executioner. He's going around and he was showing the victims, the alleged mercy of strangulation before they were burnt at the stake. So they're not being burnt alive. If you confess to witchcraft, you were shown this alleged mercy of being strangled before you were burnt. And the reason that the victims are being burnt in these sort of strange hut-like constructions was it was a lot cheaper and easier to burn several people. You could use one stake and brushwood that you built the hut out of, rather than a big heap of expensive logs per individual. So this was a kind of a way that the judicial machinery and judicial budget was adapting to the costs of these large executions. To give everybody their own stake and their own pile of logs was just simply very, very expensive. So this was a way of trying to manage the costs of mass execution. Why did things get so out of hand? This is just to finish off with. Well, what's very different about a lot of the witch trials in Germany and Switzerland and other parts of Europe was that torture was used to effectively force people to confess. In England, torture wasn't used in the criminal law. It could only be used if it was authorised centrally by the monarch or by the Privy Council. So you do see it being used for example, in cases of treason, like the gunpowder plot. We know, for example, that Guy Fawkes and the other conspirators were tortured. But for the most part, in terms of sort of everyday justice, everyday witch trials, whereas in German courts, for example, there was a much stronger likelihood that you would be tortured. That wasn't the case in England. And obviously, the minute you start using torture and excessively using torture, it's obviously much more likely that people are going to be forced into confessing that they were witches and then being convicted. And the other factor that played into this much more severe pattern of witch hunting in other parts of Europe was a belief in the witches' Sabbath. And this was the idea that witches gathered in relatively large numbers to worship the devil, to plot their harmful magical deeds, and essentially to try to subvert Christian society. Now, none of these witches' Sabbaths really happen. They're not a real thing, but people thought that they were, and that's the key point. They felt that there really was this massive demonic conspiracy going on. And so what you tended then to get in these large trials was a dynamic where a suspect would be asked if they were witches. They would be tortured into confessing their guilt, but then they would also be subsequently tortured and asked, who else did you see at the witches' Sabbath? And once you've got that dynamic going of torture, confession, and then denunciation of other people who were supposedly at the witches' Sabbath, it was in those very specific legal circumstances that trials could really very, very quickly escalate into very, very large numbers, because the next batch of suspects would also then be questioned, tortured, and asked about the witches' gathering. And this is an image from the late 16th century. This is an image of the alleged witches' Sabbath that was linked to the very large witch trials that happened in the electoral territory of Trier in Germany. And you can see, hopefully, this image is just to really give you a flavour of how much more complicated things could get once you start imagining or believing in a witch's Sabbath. You've got a man here, he's the king of the Sabbath. You've got people playing music, that's another man there. You've got people arriving at the Sabbath in a coach. You've even got men of the cloth at the witches' Sabbath. So the minute you take this idea of a collective conspiracy of witches seriously, the whole scale of things can just escalate very rapidly and to very dismal ends insofar as many executions could happen. So Essex, I think, probably was the worst county in all of England for witchcraft accusations and probably for witchcraft executions. But I think there were other counties in England which also had a fair number of trials, and certainly Suffolk in 1645 is a very important example there. And I think overall, because England didn't use torture and because England didn't really subscribe to this idea of the witches' Sabbath, even though people were tried, they were by no means always necessarily convicted, and we certainly didn't get this mass escalation of persecution that we see in some parts, for example, of Germany. But I wanted to finish with this wonderful memorial to the victims of the Essex witch hunts that some of you may have seen. It's outside Colchester Castle in Colchester. And I wouldn't want you to think that just because I'm trying to compare what went on in Essex and say, well, it wasn't as bad as what went on elsewhere. I certainly don't want you to think that I'm trying to relativize the suffering of the people who were charged with witchcraft in Essex. I mean, I think we only have to look at Colchester Castle and imagine being in the dungeons there awaiting trial. I mean, you could die of the plague before you even got to trial in conditions like that. So even though I'm trying to give you a bit of a comparative perspective, I don't want in any way to suggest that it wouldn't have been absolutely horrific to be accused of witchcraft in early modern Essex, and certainly for people like Joan Prentice or Agnes Waterhouse, it was no consolation to them as they ended up getting hanged for witchcraft. It was no consolation to them to think that it perhaps wasn't quite as bad in Essex as it was in other parts of Europe. So on that commemorative note, I will end the talk.
Thank you very much, Alison.
Thank you very much.
Good. There's four people have indicated to me so far through the chat they'd like to ask a question. The first person was Paul Levy. You want to unmute yourself and ask your question, Paul?
I can see it in the chat.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. I was just
yeah, it's as per in the chat. Yes.
Yeah, Paul. Just shall I repeat it, Paul? So Paul had asked, yes. Why do I think that there's still so much interest in witchcraft and the occult in the 21st century? I think that's a really, really interesting question. I think there are probably various reasons. I think one is that we now think of it as a really bizarre thing to do, to go around actually formally trying people and even executing them for something that we know wasn't a real thing. I mean, people couldn't really kill somebody by cursing them, and people didn't really fly to Sabbaths and so on. So I think it's this sort of horror, but this sort of perhaps horrified fascination with this bizarre thing that could result in so many executions. And I think when we're sort of baffled by something and horrified by it, we want to try and just find out, what was really going on. But I think as well, it's become a really important part of 21st century sort of popular culture. I mean, if you think about the number of books and films and sort of TV shows and general interest there is in the occult, and certainly I think a big factor there is the emergence of modern day witchcraft and Wicca since sort of the end of the Second World War. So I think it's witchcraft is in all sorts of different areas. I mean, there's historical witchcraft, but there's also modern day witchcraft, there's sort of cultural entertainment witchcraft with Harry Potter and so on. So I think because it's functioning and developing in all sorts of different levels, I think that keeps the subject very, very much alive. And certainly, there is still a lot of interest in it, which I think is a good thing, because I think it's a really important thing to look at. But I think I'm always interested in looking at the history of it rather perhaps than the the sort of modern day cultural engagement with it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Alison. The next question is from John. If you like to read it out for us.
Okay.
John asks, what do you believe were the key factors in explaining the number of high cases in Suffolk and Essex?
Yes, I mean, do you think that they're, I mean, obviously the actions of those sort of few zealots and individuals like Hopkins, but were there underlying factors that made Essex and Suffolk more, that could explain why it was more marked in those counties than other counties such as Kent?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, it's quite surprising to me that not more work has been done to try and explain it. And I think that these key individuals do matter, but I think you're absolutely right. You can never just get a witch trial or a witch finding campaign just because one or two men want to do it. You've got to have communities who are willing to make accusations, and you've got to have communities that are willing to stand as witnesses as well. So you've got to always have community input to make trials successful. I mean, I think in 1645, I think what's obvious is that Essex and Suffolk are, you know, quite strongly Puritan counties, but there are also Puritan counties that do have some pockets of recusant Catholicism in them still. So I think there's quite a strong connection in 17th century East Anglia between Puritan communities who are kind of wanting to show their godly credentials, perhaps by getting involved in witch trials. So I think religious sort of religious commitment, but also religious tension between Puritans and Catholics plays a role. I think the other thing is it's not every community in Essex and Suffolk. And again, if you take that comparative analysis down to the regional level, if you map the counties, the communities within the counties that welcome the witch finders, it's not absolutely everyone. So I think what you have in most of these villages, there are probably suspected witches, and then communities make some sort of decision about whether they're going to use the witch finders to actually formally prosecute them, and some do, and some don't, and that can often come down to very fine-grained decisions. You know, how many people are on one side, how many on the other? Are people willing to pay the expenses of trials? And if not, actually then they suddenly lose interest. So I think once you get down to those really local circumstances, I think you're right that there are lots of individual people and individual reasons for that final decision.
Thank you.
Question by Ben Markham.
Hi, Alison.
Hi, Ben. Nice to see you.
You're right. Nice to see you again. Thank you for your wonderful talk today. I just wanted to ask a question, I suppose picking up on a point right at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. You started with a pamphlet from Malden, and you talked about Samuel, an Essex man, albeit a fictionalized one, attributing to his own county the title of the worst county for witchcraft. And I just wondered was this a reputation that Essex had outside of that particular county? Did others view Essex from the outside almost as a place to be avoided, enter if you dare sort of thing for Essex?
I think certainly by the late 16th century, I think it probably does have that reputation. And I think that's probably partly as much to do with the pamphlets as anything else, because I mean, most people wouldn't necessarily have known what was going on in the Assais courts in another county, but they would have perhaps heard of what was going on through a pamphlet. And the pamphlets do foreground the women that they say where they're from in the county, and that those images of them being hanged and so on. So I do think there is this growing perception. I think it's the St. Ozith pamphlet. I think that was a really, really interesting trial, not just because it was so big, but also because Darcy then gets the pamphlet out there. So I think the minute you publish anything at that level, you are spreading that message. So I don't know whether people would have thought, let's not go there, because what the pamphlets are saying is, yes, we've got lots of witches, but we're doing something about it. So it's partly a message about the law dealing with the problem. I mean, that's why the image of the hanging is important. So it's not that we're letting witches get away with it, but actually we are policing this. We're doing this, we're managing this problem. And I think, again, it depends. I mean, we haven't said anything about white witches and cunning folk, but they were believed to be actually able to work good magic. And if you actually read the rest of George Gifford's pamphlet, his dialogue between Daniel and Sam, what Gifford's really most bothered about is the large number of Essex cunning folk who are plying their trade in white magic and persuading people to believe in white magic. And actually Gifford is as concerned about the white magic as he is about the black. And actually for a lot of ordinary people, they would have traveled miles to go and see, some of the famous Essex cunning folk, because they would have thought they could help against witches and they could help against disease. So Gifford's fighting a bit of a losing battle, really. He's trying to persuade ordinary people to generally stop believing in any sort of witchcraft or magic. And obviously for people like Samuel, that's quite a big ask. So yeah, I think there's definitely contemporary perception there. But I don't know that it would have necessarily been seen as quite as negative. It was more about what the Essex JPs were doing about it, I think.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben.
Next question is from Tony Tuckwell.
Yeah, Tony's asked about the peaks of Essex witch finding in the late 16th century in 1645 and the growth of intolerant Puritan interest. And I think going back to the earlier question, I think from John, I think certainly the there is a link there between the religious growing sort of religious radicalism or intolerance and this idea of the need to persecute witches. And I think that's interesting because it suggests that the witch in that context is seen much more as a sort of a religious deviant. So whereas ordinary people were much more concerned about the harmful magic the witch could do in the form of, you know, killing people and livestock and so on, I think we're probably seeing a concern with the sort of religious perception of the witch as a religious deviant. So certainly I think there are links there with Puritanism and a growing sense of the need to root out witchcraft for religious reasons. And again, in 1645, I think you can see those ideas mapping onto one another. And I think you can see that with you know, the JPs. I mean, we know Sterne and Hopkins were fairly strongly Puritan minor gentry, and I think the two Essex JPs as well. So yes, I think it is. I think religion matters, and I think also, I think with Brian Darcy there is a certain degree of desire to forward his own career. So I think again, I think with most of these things, there's never just. I think there are important factors and dominant factors, but there are usually several factors at work in the same, you know, in the same case. So I think Brian Darcy was also trying to sort of you know, make some career advances as well as trying to persecute, you know, godless deviants when he oversaw the St. Ozith witch trials.
Got this 4 more people asked questions, 3 through the chat and 1 I was showing you. There's Peter Evans, someone called WEL, Rowena, and Frank Gill.
Mm-hmm.
Next is Peter
Okay,
Evans.
Judy asked, was it mainly women? Yes, it was mainly women. I mean, Essex is very unusual in the fact that the sort of stereotype of the witch as a woman stays very constant. Something like 93% of all of those executed are women. So there are some men, but they are much fewer in number and much less likely to sort of be treated with the full rigors of the law in the trial. So I think that the stereotype of the witch as a woman stays fairly strong in Essex. It tends to break down much more in those parts of Europe where you have that idea of a witch's Sabbath, because once you start imagining that mass gathering of witches, it's much easier to imagine men and families. I mean, actually the idea of the witch family comes out as well, where you get a mother and a father and children, you get clerics imagined there and the king of the Sabbath. So I think because England is much more resistant to the idea of the witch's Sabbath, I think that helps the idea of the witch as a woman stay much more constant.
Can I add to the question, please? Thank you very much, by the way, for the talk. Really interesting and clear. Was there any sense, because I was told at school, part of the reason that women...
People have asked questions in order. We have got a series, so you don't...
Yeah, it's to do with them being women, whether they were a drain on the economy of the local rural community because the community was having to keep them. So it was one way of absolving their costs. That's all I wanted to say. Sorry.
Okay. Some of them certainly were older and poorer. So, for example, in the St. Ozith witch trial, we know that a couple of the women who were accused in the St. Ozith witch trial were dependent on poor relief. But again, I think that was a really good starting point in the historiography of the subject. But I think what we've learned now is that it was probably more complicated than that. So yes, that certainly holds up for quite a few of the women. But in some cases, for example, Ursula Kemp, who was one of the women executed from St. Ozith in 1582, she was also a reputed cunning woman who was meant to be able to work low-level white magic. So it wasn't just her position as a woman, but it was her position as a woman with some sort of white magical expertise. We also know that some of the women in St. Ozith were accused because they probably had poor sexual reputations. They had illegitimate children. So again, they may have been older and poorer when they were accused, but it's quite likely that their poor sexual reputation played a role as well. And I think the really interesting thing is that quite a few of these women are accused with daughters or in these sort of little family groups, a mother-daughter or a sister-sister, and that probably hints at an idea that there's this idea of sort of witch families where this sort of reputation is being passed on from mothers to daughters. And very often we just don't know the ages and the social status of a lot of them. So I think a lot of them have been assumed to be old and poor, but we don't often absolutely know that. So I think there's probably more complexity to some of the accusations. So while the gendering, I think, is a very important point and it stays very constant, I think, you know, there are other reasons why individuals get accused as well. Peter asked about Sir Harbottle Grimston. He and Sir Thomas Bowes had actually been interested in witch persecution before 1645. So a couple of the women who were accused in that Essex phase of the East Anglian witch hunts in Manningtree, it looks as though Sir Harbottle and Sir Thomas Bowes have already tried to get them convicted, get them prosecuted before 1645. So it looks as though they were quite keen to facilitate witch trials in their sort of local manorial areas, and it's the sort of moment of the Civil War, and then the help they get from Hopkins and Stern that really helps them get that off the ground. I think because the witch trials then move into Suffolk and away from the Tendring Hundred, and because there's been that opposition in Colchester, I think the sort of Essex enthusiasm for the persecution dies down. It's almost that they've done their bit, you know, they've had their trial, they've had their moment, and then things move on into Suffolk. But what was very striking about the Essex executions in 1645, as well as the 15 women who were hanged in Chelmsford, 4 of the women who'd been convicted were actually taken back to Manningtree and hanged in Manningtree, and that's very, very unusual. So that would have been a real kind of sort of justification for the 2 local JPs. I mean, it was almost as though they were being given the honour of having 4 of these women hanged on their own patch, if you like. And that was unusual. I mean, obviously most of the executions would always take place in Chelmsford after the Assizes, but these 4 women were taken back. So I think they were very important in that early phase. But then when the focus shifts to Suffolk, it's more the intervention of you know, Suffolk authorities that's critical.
Thank you. I asked about Harbottle Grimston because I've never known much about him, but the road I live in is named after him.
Interesting.
I didn't realise he had that background, so thank you.
Well, it's interesting. I think if I look at witch trials, I see people like Darcy or Sir Thomas Bowes, you know, I see them in relation to the witch trial, but obviously they had much longer political careers where they did lots of other things. And to them, the witch trial bit was just part of a great, you know, long list of other things that they were involved in and other trials that they would have overseen and so on. So, you know, for them, it was probably just a sort of a minor part of their career, but obviously for the witch trial historian and indeed for the people accused of witchcraft, it was much more significant. Somebody in the chat asked about whether witches were more prevalent in rural areas. Certainly many more suspects from rural areas are accused and tried, but I think that's largely a function of the fact that most of England and most of Europe was still agrarian at this time, was still very rural. So you know, it's kind of almost inevitable that most suspects come from villages, but there are also cases from towns, and again, it, you know, technically Manningtree is a town, so, you know, we could say that the Manningtree suspects are urban in that sense, but in terms of the beliefs about the witches, there's no meaningful real difference between the sorts of things that rural and urban witches were believed capable of doing. I think the key thing is the sort of people they were and whether or not they'd fallen out with their neighbours. So if you were a perhaps slightly aggressive, bad-tempered, interfering person who perhaps cursed quite a lot and didn't show enough gratitude when you were given things, if you were that sort of a person, you were more at risk of getting a suspicion of being a witch. And I don't think it mattered too much if you were a rural person or an urban person, but the risk was there. I think probably the main difference perhaps with urban context was you were perhaps a little bit more mobile. You might be able to get away from those suspicions by moving, whereas you might be a bit more rooted in a rural community.
Rowena had a question. You need to unmute yourself, Rowena. You need to unmute yourself.
That better?
Yes.
Can you? Thank you very much, Alison. I noticed in the tables that you gave us of Europe, Turkey was at the 0 and 0 for population and action. And I wondered, is that because who compiled the tables didn't have the information, or whether there was a different attitude in Islam from Christianity?
That's a great question. I'm going to go back to my table just to see where we were. It may well be lack of stats. And I mean, I think, you know, it is very hard to get these statistics for the 16th and 17th century. So I think partly it's a lack of statistics, and I don't know enough about attitudes towards witches in Islam. It may entirely reflect what you're saying. The other thing it might reflect is that communities do have people in their midst that they fear and that they believe could work harmful magic, but they deal with them differently. So we can only count executions because they've gone through the courts and they've generated some sort of written material. So for example, in Ireland, it's been, which also has a very, very low number by comparison, it's been suggested for Ireland that the Irish didn't want to use the what they saw as the sort of colonial English witchcraft legislation. So it's been argued that the Irish were reluctant to sort of instigate and witch trials and persecute witches because that had all sorts of sort of implications to do with colonial legal systems. Now, what may have been happening and what's probably happening in those cases is that there's some policing of witches that's not happening through the court. So there might be informal justice, mob justice, or other methods such as you know, what you can do to try and cope with witches is exclude them from social networks, for example, refuse to have anything to do with them, not invite them to festivities. So there's a whole range of what we could call informal or semi-formal policing methods that don't necessarily result in trials. So it may be that similar things might be going on in the Turkish context, that things are just being managed in some way that's not making a mark on the historical record. So obviously as historians, we're very, you know, much linked, you know, we're tied to what we can actually see in the historical record. But that's a really interesting question. I'm going to actually, because Beringer published this in 2004, he may actually have more up-to-date stats than he had then. So I'm going to, thank you for that. I'm going to pursue that with him and ask him if he's got more up-to-date information, because it does look a bit weird to have it in there with 0. Yeah, somebody in the chat as well asked about books for further reading. I mean, it really depends what area people are interested in. I mean, the best book on witchcraft in Essex is Alan McFarlane's book, which is called Witchcraft in Tudor and Stuart England, but it's actually really a brilliant study of witch trials in Essex. So McFarlane is by far the best for Essex. But if you maybe if you put in the chat if there's something more specific that you wanted, and then I can either put something in the chat in response, or I could drop you an email with a few ideas if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Alison. I don't know if we've got no more questions. I've been indicated. Do we hand over? Is Ian here now?
I am.
Hand over to Ian, it's the chair.
Thank you very much. Professor Rowlands, very well done. And can I ask Shirley now? Shirley would like to propose you a vote of thanks.
Yeah.
Alison, can you hear me?
Yes, we can all hear you.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Alison. That was really great and a fascinating and stimulating talk. And we could see the interest you generated by the question and answer session. You managed to bring your own sort of painstaking research and that of others. You managed to make it accessible to a wide audience, and we're very grateful. So on behalf of Essex branch of the Historical Association, very many thanks, Alison. Hope to see you again.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you for the great questions. They are very thought-provoking. So I always learn a lot when I do talks like this. So that's really good questions from the audience.
Professor Rowlands, whilst present circumstances prevented you from suffering a light luncheon with us, we will be making a little token gesture of our appreciation. But thank you very much again.
Yes.
Thank you.
And the rest of you, don't forget